Money buys silence. It buys loyalty politicians and the best beachfront real estate in Miami. But Victor Rossi learned the hard way that $20 million and 20 Ivy League medical degrees can't buy a single extra breath. They told him his nervous system was failing. They wrote prescriptions, cashed his checks, and waited for him to die. They were wrong. The person who saved the most feared man in the city didn't have a stethoscope. She had a feather duster. The Rossi estate smelled like bleach and dying orchids. It was a jarring combination. For a decade, the mansion had smelled of imported Cuban tobacco, aged leather, and the sharp metallic tang of cold, hard cash. Now the third-floor master suite resembled an intensive care unit. A web of transparent tubing snaked across the Persian rugs. Monitors beeped in steady, monotonous rhythms that mocked the silence of the massive house. Victor Rossi was dying. At 42, the head of the Rossi syndicate had survived 2 assassination attempts, a federal indictment, and a turf war that had left half the city's concrete red. He was a man built out of granite and bad intention, standing 6'3" with a barrel chest and a jawline that looked forged in a steel mill. Now he was a ghost in his own bed. His skin had taken on a grayish, translucent pallor. His muscles were wasting away, stripping the intimidation from his frame, leaving only the sharp angles of his skeleton pressing against the high thread count sheets. It's an aggressive progression of a motor neuron disease, Dr. Lipton said, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses. He was doctor number 17, or maybe 18. Victor had lost count. Lipton stood at the foot of the bed, flanked by 3 other specialists holding digital tablets. They wore crisp white coats over expensive tailored suits. None of them looked Victor in the eye. They looked at the monitors. They looked at the charts. They looked at the impressive array of zeros on the retainer checks the Rossi family lawyers handed them. The demyelination is accelerating. A neurologist from Johns Hopkins added, tapping her stylus against her screen. We can increase the corticosteroids, perhaps introduce a new round of immunosuppressants. But Mr. Rossi, you need to understand that we are managing the descent. We are not halting it. Victor didn't speak. He couldn't. His jaw trembled, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that had started 3 months ago and never stopped. He stared at the ceiling, his chest rising and falling with shallow, ragged breaths. He hated them. He hated their clean hands and their soft, practiced voices of sympathy. They were vultures in white coats picking over his remains before his heart even stopped beating. Millions of dollars. State-of-the-art brain scans, experimental blood washes in Switzerland, spinal taps that left him in blinding agony for days. And for what? For a group of cowards to stand in his bedroom and tell him his nervous system was simply short-circuiting for no reason. In the corner of the room, completely ignored by the medical elite, Tessa Harper wrung out a sponge into a plastic bucket. Tessa was 28, exhausted and functionally invisible. She wore a drab grey uniform that hid her figure and sensible rubber-soled shoes that made no sound on the hardwood floors. She kept her brown hair tied back in a tight, severe bun. For the past year, she had been part of the ghost crew, the unseen army of maids, cooks, and groundskeepers who kept the Rossi estate running. She scrubbed the baseboards. She dusted the mahogany bookshelves. She emptied the wastebaskets filled with blood-spotted tissues and empty pill bottles, and she watched. Tessa had no medical degree. She had dropped out of community college at 19 when her mother was diagnosed with late-stage pancreatic cancer, trading textbooks for double shifts at a diner and nights spent arguing with insurance adjusters. After her mother passed, her younger brother racked up 20 grand in gambling debts with the wrong kind of people, the Rossi family's people. Tessa took the maid job to pay it off, scrubbing floors to keep her brother's kneecaps intact. She knew what dying looked like. She knew the smell of organs shutting down. But as she wiped down the brass handles of Victor's bedroom doors Listening to the specialists murmur their terminal diagnoses, Tessa felt a cold prickle of certainty at the back of her neck. This wasn't a disease. She wrung the sponge out again, her eyes darting to the bed. Victor was seizing slightly, his left hand clenching into a claw. The doctors noted it on their clipboards. Fasciculations, they called it. Muscle twitching. But Tessa noticed something else. She noticed the faint, bluish line at the very edge of Victor's gums when his lips parted to gasp for air. She noticed the way his hair was thinning in patchy, irregular clumps on his pillowcase. She noticed the erratic, excessive sweating that soaked his sheets every night, smelling faintly of garlic and metal. She had seen these exact symptoms once before. Not in a hospital. In the squalid, crumbling tenement building she had grown up in right before the city health department condemned the place. The doctors wrapped up their consultation, their voices a synchronized hum of professional defeat. "We'll adjust the IV drip," Dr. Lipton said, finally offering Victor a tight, patronizing smile. "Try to get some rest, Victor. Let the medication do its work." They filed out of the room, their leather shoes clicking down the hallway, leaving the dying boss alone with the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen concentrator. Tessa stayed on her knees. She dragged her bucket a few feet closer to the nightstand. Victor's eyes rolled toward her. They were bloodshot, the sclera tinged with an unhealthy yellow. He looked at her, not as a maid, but as another piece of furniture in a room he was never going to leave. Tessa didn't look away. She stared at his trembling hand, then up at the heavy, customized IV bag hanging from the metal pole beside his bed. The bag the doctors had just pumped full of immunosuppressants and steroids to treat a failing nervous system. If she was right that IV was going to kill him by midnight, she gripped the handle of her sponge. She was a nobody. A high school graduate with a brother in debt to the mob. If she spoke up, they would laugh at her. If she intervened, Victor's bodyguards would put a bullet in her head and bury her in the Pine Barrens. But looking at the once powerful man, now suffocating under the weight of a $20 million misdiagnosis, Tessa knew she couldn't just keep wiping the floors. The Rossi estate ran on a strict schedule, engineered for maximum security and minimal disruption. Shift changes for the armed guards happened at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. The private chefs prepared Victor's liquid nutrition at exactly 8 a.m., 1 p.m., and 7 p.m. The medical staff, a rotating roster of private high-priced nurses, checked his vitals every 4 hours. Tessa worked the night shift. Her job was to sanitize the surfaces, restock the medical supplies, and remain entirely unseen. At 2 a.m., the mansion was a tomb. Tessa pushed her utility cart down the heavily carpeted hallway of the 3rd floor. 2 men in dark suits stood outside Victor's double doors. One was Dante, Victor's chief enforcer, a man with a face like a scarred cinder block and eyes dead enough to freeze water. "In and out, Harper." Dante grunted as she approached. He didn't check her cart. She was the furniture. She was the help. "Yes, sir," Tessa murmured, keeping her head down. She slipped into the master suite. The air was heavy, stiflingly warm, and thick with the scent of eucalyptus from the medical humidifier. Victor lay in the center of the massive bed, barely a ripple under the heavy duvet. His breathing was wet and shallow. Tessa parked her cart by the bathroom and walked over to the nightstand. She didn't reach for her cleaning supplies. Instead, she picked up the chart the night nurse had left on the table. Blood pressure 90/60. Heart rate 110 irregular. Notes: patient experiencing severe neuropathy, vomiting, and hair loss. Tessa put the chart down. She leaned closer to Victor. He was unconscious, heavily sedated by the morphine they were pumping into him to manage the nerve pain. She gently pulled down his lower lip. There it was. Under the dim amber glow of the bedside lamp, the blue-black line running along his gums was unmistakable. Burton's line, She let go of his lip and stepped back, her heart hammering against her ribs. Lead poisoning. Or maybe arsenic. No, the hair loss and the excruciating nerve pain pointed to something more specific. Thallium. The poisoner's poison. It was tasteless, odorless, and completely undetectable unless a doctor specifically knew to run a heavy metals toxicity panel. And why would 20 of the world's top neurospecialists look for rat poison in the bloodstream of a billionaire mafia boss? They wouldn't. They were looking for exotic autoimmune disorders. They were looking for zebras ignoring the horse that was stomping Victor Rossi to death. Someone inside this house was killing him. Slowly, methodically. Tessa backed away from the bed. She had to find the source. Thallium didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was being administered in small, calculated doses over a long period. Months at least. That's why his decline was so gradual, mimicking a degenerative disease. She moved through the master suite, her eyes scanning the room with the ruthless efficiency of someone who had spent her life noticing what others discarded. The food, odd. The chefs prepared every meal from scratch, and Victor's lieutenants often ate from the same kitchen. Someone else would be sick. The IV bags, unlikely. The medical supplies were tightly inventoried and sealed. Tampering with them required a level of access that would leave too obvious a trail. Tessa moved to the attached private study. It was a dark, oak-paneled room where Victor used to conduct his business before he became bedridden. Now he spent his evenings sitting in the leather armchair by the window, staring out at the grounds while drinking his nightly herbal tea. The tea. Tessa walked over to the dry bar in the corner of the study. A silver tray sat on the marble counter. On it was a bespoke wooden tea box, custom made, containing a rare blend of chamomile valerian root and dried honey. It was exclusively for Victor, imported from a monastery in Italy, to help him sleep when the insomnia first started. She opened the box. The dried flowers smelled sweet and earthy. She dug her gloved fingers into the loose tea, sifting through the petals. At the bottom of the tin, mixed perfectly with the herbs, was a fine crystalline powder. It looked like sugar dust. Tessa touched the tip of her gloved finger to the powder, then held it up to the light. It wasn't sugar. She felt a sudden freezing drop in her stomach. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Whoever was doing this had access to Victor's private quarters. It wasn't a rival gang. It wasn't the feds. It was someone inside the inner circle. Someone who smiled at him, poured his tea, and watched him wither away while pretending to mourn. A floorboard creaked behind her. Tessa froze. She didn't turn around. Every muscle in her back locked tight. "You're not dusting the bar, Harper." The voice was a low, gravelly rasp. It didn't belong to a guard. It belonged to the ghost. Tessa turned slowly. Victor Rossi was standing in the doorway connecting the study to the bedroom. He looked horrific. He was leaning heavily on a metal cane, his knuckles bone white. His pajamas hung off his emaciated frame. He was shaking violently, sweat beading on his forehead from the sheer effort of standing. But his eyes, dark, hollowed out, and rimmed with red, were sharp. Lethally sharp. "Mr. Rossi?" Tessa breathed, her voice trembling. "You shouldn't be out of bed. And you shouldn't be going through my private stock." Victor wheezed. Each word sounded like glass grinding against stone. He took a painful, shuffling step forward. "Did Leo send you? Did you come to finish the job?" He pulled his hand from the pocket of his robe. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely grip the heavy, suppressed 1911 pistol he aimed at her chest. "No," Tessa said, raising her hands slowly, keeping the wooden tea box on the counter. "No, Mr. Rossi. I'm just the maid." "Maid's clean." Victor said, his breath hitching as a spasm rocked his chest. He gripped the cane tighter, fighting to keep the gun level. "You're snooping. Give me one reason I shouldn't put a hole in you right now and let Dante mop you up." Tessa looked at the gun. She looked at the man holding it. He was a monster, a ruthless criminal who had likely ordered the deaths of dozens of men. The smart thing to do was to beg, to cry, to make up an excuse and run. But Tessa was tired. She was tired of the fear, tired of the debt, tired of watching rich, arrogant doctors get paid millions to be blind. She didn't beg. She lowered her hands and picked up the wooden tea box. "Because," Tessa said, her voice dropping the deferential, hushed tone of a servant, "if you shoot me, you're going to be dead by Friday. And you're going to die thinking your body failed you when the truth is you're just being played for a fool." Victor's eyes narrowed. The gun wavered just an inch. "What did you say to me? You don't have ALS. You don't have a motor neuron disease," Tessa said, taking a step toward him. "Stop right there," Victor growled. Tessa didn't stop. She walked right up to the barrel of the gun, holding out the tea box. "They're charging you 50 grand a week to watch you drink rat poison, Mr. Rossi," she said, her voice hard, echoing in the quiet study. "You have severe heavy metal toxicity, probably thallium. Someone has been lacing your tea for months. Look at your gums. Look at your hair. You're not sick. You're being murdered." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. The only sound in the room was the harsh, ragged pull of Victor's breathing and the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Victor stared at the plain, grey-clad maid, standing inches from the barrel of his gun. Her brown eyes didn't flinch. There was no panic in her face, only a weary, bitter frustration. "Thallium." Victor repeated the word, tasting like ash in his mouth. He lowered the gun half an inch. "You're telling me 20 of the top neurologists on the eastern seaboard missed poison, but a girl with a mop figured it out. Top neurologists look for complex neurological failures," Tessa replied evenly. "They don't look for slumlord rat poison. They assume you're insulated. They see the security, the money, the gates, and they rule out foul play because they think no one can get to you. But poison isn't a bullet. Poison is quiet. Poison is a friend pouring you a cup of tea before bed." Victor's jaw tightened. Another tremor racked his body, forcing him to lean heavily onto the cane. He closed his eyes, fighting through a wave of nauseating nerve pain that fired down his spine. When he opened them again, he looked at the wooden box in her hands. "Show me," he rasped. Tessa brought the box closer. She tilted it toward the dim light of the desk lamp. "Look at the bottom. Under the leaves. There's a crystalline residue. Thallium sulfate is a white, odorless powder. It dissolves instantly in hot water. You wouldn't taste a thing." Victor squinted. His vision had been blurring for weeks, another symptom the doctors chalked up to nerve decay. But he could see the faint sparkle of powder against the dark wood of the box. He slowly lowered the gun, letting it hang at his side. The sheer physical exertion of standing was breaking him. His legs buckled slightly, and Tessa instantly dropped the box, stepping forward to catch him under his arm before he hit the floor. "Don't touch me," he snarled on instinct, jerking away. Tessa didn't let go. "You weigh about 160 pounds right now, Mr. Rossi. If you hit this hardwood, your collarbone is going to snap. Let me help you to the chair." He glared at her, the pride of a dying king, warring with the absolute reality of his weakness. Finally, he gave a curt, tight nod. Tessa braced her shoulder under his armpit, bearing his weight as she guided him to the heavy leather armchair by the window. He collapsed into it, gasping for air, a cold sweat drenching his collar. Tessa stepped back, giving him space. She retrieved the gun from the floor where he had dropped it, placed it on the desk, out of his immediate reach but visible, and stood with her hands clasped behind her back. Victor watched her. She handled the weapon without flinching. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, his voice a raw whisper. "Tessa Harper. I clean the third floor." "Where did you learn about heavy metals?" "Tessa Harper. In the projects in South Boston, Tessa said her voice devoid of emotion. The landlord used cheap illegal thallium paste to kill the rats in the walls. It seeped into the drywall. 3 kids on my floor ended up in the ICU with identical symptoms to yours. Hair falling out in clumps, blue lines on the gums, nerve pain so bad they screamed when the sheets touched their skin. I recognized the smell on your sweat 3 days ago. Victor processed this. His brilliant mind, clouded by months of toxins and morphine, struggled to cut through the fog. If you knew 3 days ago, why didn't you say anything? To who? Tessa let out a short, cynical laugh. To Dr. Lipton. He wouldn't even look at me when I asked him to move his foot so I could mop. To Dante, he'd shoot me for speaking out of turn. To Leo. At the mention of his underboss, Victor's eyes darkened. Leo had been managing the syndicate's affairs since Victor fell ill. Leo was the one who hired the doctors. Leo was the one who brought the custom tea from Italy. You think it's Leo? Victor said, the realization sinking into his bones like ice water. I don't care who it is, Tessa said plainly. I just care about the debt. Victor's brow furrowed. Debt. My brother owes your people $20,000 from a bad sports betting run. I took this job to pay it off in installments. If you die, Leo takes over. Leo isn't patient. He'll kill my brother within the week to set an example. Tessa looked him dead in the eye. I need you alive, Mr. Rossi, because I need you to wipe the ledger clean. Victor stared at her. A slow, dark amusement flickered in his bloodshot eyes. He was surrounded by sycophants, assassins, and Ivy League cowards, and the only person telling him the truth was a maid leveraging his murder to save her degenerate brother. It was the most honest transaction he had engaged in for a year. You have balls, Harper. Victor muttered, wiping his mouth with the back of his trembling hand. I'll give you that. I have leverage, Tessa corrected. But we don't have time. The thallium has saturated your tissues. Your kidneys are starting to fail. If you don't start chelation therapy immediately, you're going to die anyway. Chelation. It's a treatment that binds to heavy metals in the bloodstream so your body can excrete them, Tessa explained. Prussian blue is the standard antidote for thallium, but you can't go to a hospital. If Leo finds out, you know he won't wait for the poison to finish you. He'll put a pillow over your face tonight. Victor knew she was right. The syndicate was a shark tank. Blood in the water meant a feeding frenzy. If he showed sudden signs of recovery, or if he openly accused Leo without the strength to back it up, a civil war would rip his empire apart, and he would be the first casualty. So what's your play, Doctor? Victor asked mockingly, though there was real curiosity beneath the gravel of his voice. I'm going to cure you, Tessa said. Right here, under their noses. Victor let out a harsh, barking cough that might have been a laugh. You're going to smuggle medical-grade antidotes into a house guarded by 30 armed men and administer it yourself. Yes. And how do you plan to explain why I'm suddenly getting better? You're not going to get better, Tessa said. Not visibly. You're going to act sicker. You're going to let them think the poison is working. I'll swap your tea with regular chamomile. I'll dump the poisoned batches. We need to buy time for the Prussian blue to clear your nervous system. Victor looked at his trembling hands, the blue line on his gums. The empire he had built currently being stolen from him, 1 cup of tea at a time. The absolute audacity of the woman standing in front of him. If you're wrong about this, Victor said quietly, a lethal promise in his tone, and you pump me full of whatever you find on the street, I'll make sure Dante skins your brother alive while you watch. And if I'm right, Tessa shot back completely unfazed, you wipe the 20 grand, and you owe me your life. Victor leaned his head back against the leather chair. The morphine was wearing off, and the searing, jagged pain was returning to his legs, a brutal reminder of his ticking clock. He didn't have 20 doctors anymore. He had one invisible maid with nothing to lose. "Deal," the Mafia boss whispered into the dark. "Go get your antidote, Tessa." Procuring pharmaceutical-grade Prussian blue without a prescription didn't require a miracle. It required desperation and a bus ticket to the South Side. Tessa got off shift at 6 in the morning. She didn't sleep. She took the transit line down to a neighborhood where the streetlights were mostly shattered and the storefronts hid behind rusted iron grates. She walked 3 blocks in the freezing drizzle to a dilapidated pharmacy run by a man named Arthur. Arthur had lost his medical license a decade ago for running oxycodone out the back door, but he still had supply lines. He didn't ask questions. He just looked at the $600 Tessa slapped on the glass counter, her entire month's rent scraped together from tip jars and pawned jewelry. "Radio Gardaz," Arthur muttered, sliding a generic brown pill bottle across the scratched glass. 30 capsules, 50 milligrams each. It binds to the isotopes in the gut, but it's going to tear the stomach lining to shreds while it works. Whoever takes this is going to be shitting blue and vomiting black for a week. "I know," Tessa said. She slipped the bottle into her coat pocket and walked back out into the rain. Getting the pills into the Rossi estate was the real gamble. Security protocol dictated that all staff bags were searched at the gate. Dante was working the checkpoint when she returned for her evening shift. He looked bored, chewing on a matchstick, his heavy jacket damp from the weather. Tessa handed over her canvas tote. She had anticipated the search. She hadn't hidden the pills in her bag. She had spent an hour in a public restroom, hollowing out the false bottom of a heavy-duty industrial wax container on her utility cart. Dante unzipped her bag, tossed her uniform aside, and zipped it back up. He barely glanced at the cart. "Go scrub," he grunted. By 2 a.m. the mansion was silent again. Tessa wheeled her cart into the master suite. Victor was awake. He looked worse than the night before. The withdrawal from the poisoned tea combined with the lingering thallium in his system had triggered a violent flare-up of neuropathy. He lay tangled in the damp sheets, his breathing ragged, his hands curled inward like claws. Tessa locked the double doors. She moved to the bed, unscrewing the bottom of the wax container and pulling out the brown bottle. 3 capsules, she said, pouring the dark blue pills into her palm. She poured a glass of distilled water from his bedside pitcher. "You need to swallow these fast." Victor tried to reach for them, but his hands wouldn't obey. The tremors were violently fast, his fingers spastic. He let out a low, guttural sound of pure frustration, closing his eyes as a wave of humiliation washed over him. He was a man who commanded hundreds of armed soldiers, and he couldn't pick up a pill. Tessa didn't offer pity. Pity was a luxury for people with time. She sat on the edge of the mattress, slipped one arm behind his neck, and hoisted him up. He was deadweight, his skin burning with a low-grade fever. "Open your mouth," she ordered. He complied. She placed the pills on his tongue and held the water glass to his cracked lips. He swallowed hard, coughing as the water went down. She eased him back onto the pillows. "How long?" Victor gasped, staring at the ceiling. "A few days before the nerve pain subsides. Tonight is going to be the worst of it. The chelation process pulls the heavy metals out of your tissues and dumps them into your digestive tract. Your body is going to fight it." She wasn't exaggerating. 20 minutes later, the nausea hit him like a freight train. Victor rolled over, gagging violently. Tessa was already there, sliding a plastic basin under his chin, just as he began to retch. It was agonizing to watch. His weakened abdominal muscles seized, expelling dark, bile-stained fluid. When the heaving stopped, he collapsed back, panting, a thin line of saliva hanging from his lip. Tessa wiped his mouth with a warm, damp towel. She didn't grimace. She emptied the basin in the private bathroom, washed it with bleach to destroy any evidence of the blue tint the pills left behind, and returned to his side. For 3 hours it was a brutal, ugly cycle. Vomiting, tremors, fever sweats. Victor groaned, his pride completely stripped away. At one point his eyes rolled back, and he gripped Tessa's wrist with surprising, desperate strength, his fingernails digging into her skin. "Let it hurt," Tessa told him quietly, prying his fingers loose and holding his hand firmly in hers. "Pain means you're still alive. The poison was putting you to sleep. This is waking you up." Victor focused on her face. Through the haze of agony he saw the cold, unyielding pragmatism in her eyes. She wasn't a soft, coddling nurse. She was a survivor. She understood the mechanics of suffering. Slowly the panic in his chest began to subside, replaced by a cold, anchoring rage. By 5 a.m. the worst of the purging had passed. Victor lay perfectly still, exhausted but lucid. The heavy, suffocating fog that had clouded his brain for months felt marginally lighter. Tessa packed away the bleach and the towels. "I have to leave before the shift change." Dante checks the logs. "Tessa!" Victor's voice was a dry rasp. She paused at the door. "Why did you really come back?" he asked, his dark eyes tracking her in the dim light. "You could have tipped off the feds. You could have run. A brother's gambling debt isn't worth dying for." Tessa looked at the floor, her grip tightening on the handle of her cart. "Because I've spent my whole life watching the wrong people get away with murder. The landlord who poisoned those kids in my building, he got a fine. He lives in a gated community in Boca. He won." She looked up, meeting the Mafia boss's gaze. "I know who you are, Mr. Rossi. I know the things you've done. But the people killing you right now, they're doing it with a smile hiding behind expensive suits and tea boxes. I hate cowards." Victor didn't smile, but something shifted in his expression. A dark, absolute understanding. "Leave the door unlocked," Victor said softly. "And get some sleep, Harper. We have work to do." 3 days later, the dying king held court. Victor's mind was sharpening by the hour. The Prussian blue was working its brutal magic, pulling the thallium from his nerves. The agonizing spikes of pain had dulled to a manageable ache. He could feel his toes again. The terrifying numbness in his hands was receding. But as the poison left his body, the performance had to begin. He lay in the center of the massive bed, forcing his muscles to go slack, mimicking the hollowed-out corpse he had been earlier in the week. He let his jaw hang loose. He maintained a shallow, erratic breathing pattern. At exactly 7 p.m., the heavy oak doors opened. Leo entered. He was a sleek, immaculately groomed man in his late 30s, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than Tessa earned in 2 years. He smelled of bergamot and quiet ambition. He carried himself not like an underboss, but like a CEO inspecting a newly acquired asset. Right behind him, pushing the evening medical cart, was Tessa. "Victor," Leo said, his voice dripping with practiced, mournful sympathy. He approached the bed and placed a warm hand on Victor's blanketed leg. "How are we feeling tonight, boss?" Victor let his eyes wander, unfocusing them. He forced his hand to shake violently as he lifted it a few inches off the mattress. "Tired, Leo," he wheezed, slurring his words perfectly. "Bones feel like glass." "I know, Victor. I know." Leo sighed heavily, looking over at Tessa. "Did Dr. Lipton increase the morphine drip?" "Yes, Mr. Carmichael." Tessa lied, smoothly arranging sterile pads on the bedside table. "But the neuropathy is resisting the dosage. He's very weak today." Leo's eyes gleamed for a fraction of a second, a shark spotting blood in the water. He quickly masked it with a heavy, sorrowful nod. "It's a tragedy. A goddamn tragedy. The strongest man I know reduced to this." Leo walked over to the dry bar in the study. Victor watched him through half-closed eyelids. He watched Leo open the wooden tea box. He watched the subtle, practiced flick of Leo's wrist as he scooped the loose chamomile and the hidden thallium powder into the silver strainer. He poured the hot water. A red-hot spike of pure, unadulterated hatred drove itself into Victor's chest. This man had eaten at his table, held his daughter at her baptism, sworn an oath of blood on a cold winter night 10 years ago, and he was making him a cup of poison with a sad smile on his face. Victor kept his breathing steady, forcing his hands to remain still. If he moved now, if he wrapped his hands around Leo's throat, he wouldn't have the strength to finish the job. Dante and the guards outside were loyal to the chair, not the man. If Victor looked crazy, Leo would order him restrained. Leo walked back carrying the steaming porcelain cup on a saucer. "Here, boss," Leo said softly. "The Italian blend. It'll help you sleep. You need your rest." Victor reached out with both hands, his fingers trembling so violently they clattered against the porcelain. He brought the cup halfway to his mouth. Across the room, Tessa accidentally knocked a metal bedpan off her cart. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, echoing clang. Leo flinched, spinning around. "Watch what you're doing, you stupid—" In the split second Leo's back was turned, Victor tipped the teacup sharply to the right. The boiling, poisoned liquid poured directly onto the thick layers of his blankets, soaking instantly into the duvet. He immediately dropped the cup onto his lap with a pathetic gasp, letting it roll onto the sheets. "My fault," Victor choked out, throwing his head back as if seized by a spasm. "My hands, they just locked up." Leo turned back, his face tightening with a flash of genuine annoyance before he smoothed it back into a mask of pity. He looked at the spilled tea soaking into the heavy blankets. The dose was gone. "It's all right, Victor. It's not your fault," Leo said, his voice tight. He looked at Tessa, gesturing sharply. "Clean this up and change the boss's sheets. Jesus!" "Right away, sir," Tessa said, keeping her head bowed. She moved quickly, pulling the heavy wet duvet off Victor's lap and throwing it into her laundry bin. She wiped up the remaining drops with a thick towel, burying the poisoned fabric at the bottom of her cart. Leo checked his gold Rolex. "I have to get down to the docks, Victor. The unions are getting restless, but I'm handling it. You don't worry about a thing. I've got the family. Just rest." "You're a good brother, Leo," Victor slurred, closing his eyes. "Always, boss." Leo turned on his heel and walked out the heavy doors, clicking shut behind him. The room plunged into silence. For 10 seconds, neither Victor nor Tessa moved. Then Victor opened his eyes. The cloudy, slurring, dying man vanished. His gaze was terrifyingly sharp, cold, and utterly lethal. The predator was awake, pacing behind the bars of his own ribcage. Tessa stood by her cart, holding a fresh, unpoisoned cup of regular chamomile tea. She walked over and handed it to him. Victor took it. His hands were completely still. Not a single tremor. He took a slow sip, his eyes fixed on the door Leo had just walked through. "He thinks I'm fading." Victor said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "He thinks you're already dead," Tessa corrected quietly. Victor set the cup down on the nightstand. He looked at his hands, balling them into tight, solid fists. The strength was returning. Slowly, but it was coming back. "Keep swapping the tea, Harper," Victor ordered, his eyes never leaving the heavy oak doors. "Keep making me look weak. Let him get confident. Let him take the docks." Tessa nodded. And then Victor leaned back against the pillows, a cold, predatory smile curving the edges of his mouth. "And then," he whispered, "we burn him alive." 2 weeks. That was how long a man could pretend to be a corpse before the muscles demanded to move. By day, Victor Rossi was a withering husk. He lay motionless under the heavy blankets, breathing in shallow, artificial gasps whenever Dr. Lipton or Leo entered the room. He let the nurses check his non-existent pulse enduring their clinical detached pity. By night, the master suite became a brutal, silent gymnasium. It was 3:15 a.m. The only light came from the moon, cutting through the gap in the heavy velvet curtains. Victor was on the floor at the foot of his bed. He was in his sweatpants, barefoot, his skin slick with a cold sheen of sweat. He pushed himself up. His arms shook. The triceps, once thick with muscle, trembled violently under the strain of his own body weight. He gritted his teeth, a low hiss of air escaping his lungs, and lowered himself back down. The hardwood floor dug into his chest. 2. Tessa counted from the shadows. She sat cross-legged on the floor a few feet away, her uniform slightly rumpled, holding a cheap plastic stopwatch. Again. Victor grunted. He pushed up. His left elbow gave out. He collapsed, his shoulder slamming hard against the wood with a dull thud. He didn't cry out. He just lay there, panting, his forehead resting against the cold floorboards. The frustration radiated off him in waves. He was a man who used to spar 3 rounds with heavyweight boxers before breakfast. Now 3 push-ups felt like climbing a mountain. Tessa didn't rush to help him up. She knew better by now. She stopped the timer and logged the number on a small notepad. "That's a 20% improvement from Tuesday," she said, her voice perfectly level in the dark. Victor rolled onto his back, staring at the ornate plaster molding on the ceiling. "It's not enough. Leo called a sit-down with the capos for Friday. He's making his move. He's going to ask them to officially transfer control of the docks and the supply lines. He's accelerating the timeline." Tessa closed her notepad. "He thinks you only have a few days left. Dr. Lipton signed an affidavit for the family lawyers yesterday, stating you're in the terminal phase." Victor let out a bitter, exhausted laugh. "Terminal phase? They're already measuring me for the box." He reached a hand up. Tessa leaned forward, gripping his forearm, and hauled him into a sitting position. Their skin was damp, their faces inches apart in the gloom. She didn't pull away immediately. Over the past 2 weeks, the space between them had vanished. They existed in a strange, isolated vacuum where titles meant nothing. He wasn't a boss, she wasn't a maid. They were 2 people holding a crumbling ceiling up with their bare hands. Victor looked at her, really looked at her. Tessa had dark circles under her eyes, bruised purple from exhaustion. She was working her day shifts, sneaking him the Prussian blue, dumping the poisoned tea, and running his secret physical therapy sessions at night. She was running on caffeine and pure, unadulterated spite. "You're tired, Harper," he said quietly, his voice dropping the gravelly edge of authority. "I'm fine. Don't lie to me, not in this room." Tessa sighed, rubbing the bridge of her nose. "My brother called this afternoon. Leo's collectors cornered him in an alley behind his apartment. They broke 2 of his ribs. A warning, they said. For the debt." Victor's jaw tightened. A dangerous, jagged energy spiked in his chest. "Leo is tying up loose ends. He wants the books clean before he takes the chair. Your brother is a loose end." "I know," Tessa said. Her voice cracked just a fraction, betraying the sheer terror she was keeping bottled up behind her ribs. "If Leo takes over on Friday, the deal we made is useless. He'll kill my brother by Saturday. And he'll probably kill me just for being in the room when you died." Victor reached out. He didn't use his commanding grip. He simply placed his large, calloused hand over hers, where it rested on her knee. The warmth of his palm was a stark contrast to the chill of the room. "Nobody is touching your brother," Victor said. The words weren't a comfort. They were a blood oath. "And nobody is touching you. But I can't walk into a sit-down on Friday looking like this. If I show up weak, the capos will smell blood and back Leo anyway. I need to be a wall. I need to break him in half." Tessa looked down at his hand covering hers. She drew a slow breath, grounding herself in the steady, rhythmic beat of his pulse against her skin. The thallium was gone. His heart was strong again. "You can't fight him." Tessa said, looking back up. You don't have the stamina for a physical confrontation. I won't need to. Victor replied, his eyes turning flat and dark, like wet slate. I just need my loyalists in the room. I need Dante and Carlo. If they know the truth, Leo is a dead man walking. Dante stands guard right outside this door. Why don't you just tell him, because Leo has Dante boxed out? Victor explained. Dante is a soldier. He follows protocol. As long as I look comatose, Dante takes orders from the underboss. Leo has isolated me completely. I can't use the phones. I can't send an email. The only people who come in here are on Leo's payroll, except you. Tessa went very still. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. Victor slowly pulled his hand away. He reached toward the nightstand, opening the small drawer, and pulled out a heavy gold signet ring. It bore the Rossi family crest, a wolf holding a broken sword. He held it out to her in the moonlight. I need a proxy, Tessa. The rain in Miami didn't cleanse the streets, it just made the grease shine. Tessa pulled the collar of her cheap raincoat up around her neck as she walked down a narrow, neon-lit street in Little Havana. It was Thursday afternoon, 24 hours before Leo's sit-down. She was supposed to be picking up dry cleaning for the estate. Instead, she was walking into the heart of the Rossi Syndicate's South Side territory. Her heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs. The gold signet ring sat heavy at the bottom of her coat pocket, wrapped in a tissue. It felt like carrying a live grenade. Find the butcher shop on 8th Street, Victor had told her. Walk past the counter. Ask for Carlo. Tell him you want to buy the prime cut for the old man. Show him the ring. He'll know what it means. She found the shop. The faded awning read, Carniceria Delgado. The smell of raw meat bleach and old copper hit her the moment she pushed the glass door open. A bell jingled overhead. Behind the glass display case, a massive man with a thick neck and a blood-stained apron was aggressively hacking apart a side of beef with a cleaver. He didn't look up when she entered. We're closed. He grunted in Spanish, bringing the cleaver down with a sickening crunch of bone. Tessa walked up to the counter. Her knees felt like water, but she forced her spine entirely straight. I'm looking for Carlo. The man stopped. He left the cleaver embedded in the chopping block and slowly wiped his hands on a rag. He looked at her. Really looked at her, assessing the cheap coat, the sensible shoes, the lack of backup. Nobody here by that name, lady. Buy a steak or get out. I want to buy the prime cut. Tessa said, keeping her voice steady, exactly how she rehearsed it in the mirror. For the old man. The butcher's eyes narrowed. The hostile indifference vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating suspicion. He reached under the counter. Tessa didn't know much about guns, but she knew the sound of a pump-action shotgun sliding off a metal rack. Who the hell are you? He demanded softly. I'm the maid, Tessa said. She reached into her pocket. The butcher's shoulders tensed, ready to bring the weapon up. Tessa moved slowly, deliberately, pulling her hand out and placing the tissue on the smudged glass counter. She unwrapped it. The heavy gold ring gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. The butcher stared at it. The color drained out of his face, leaving a grey, ashen shock in its wake. Every man in the Rossi family knew that ring. It hadn't left Victor Rossi's finger since the day his father died. Its presence here in the hands of a terrified woman in a cheap raincoat meant the world was tilting on its axis. A door at the back of the shop creaked open. A man stepped out of the shadows. He was in his 50s, wearing a sharp, tailored suit that looked entirely out of place in a slaughterhouse. He had salt and pepper hair and a face marked by decades of quiet violence. Carlo. He walked up to the counter, his eyes fixed entirely on the ring. He didn't touch it. Where did you get this? Carlo asked. His voice was soft, but it carried a lethal edge that made the butcher step back. He gave it to me. Tessa said. Victor is dying, Carlo said, scanning her face for a lie. Dr. Lipton said he hasn't been lucid in 3 days. Leo said he's writing the eulogy. Leo is the one digging the grave. Tessa shot back, her fear suddenly giving way to a hot, reckless anger. Victor doesn't have ALS. He was poisoned. Thallium. Leo has been slipping it into his tea for 6 months. The silence in the butcher shop was absolute. The only sound was the hum of the meat refrigerators. Carlo stared at her, his expression utterly unreadable. Accusing the underboss of poisoning the Don was a death sentence. To do it on his own turf was madness. And you know this how? Carlo asked. Because I caught it. Because I've been treating him for 2 weeks with Prussian blue. He's awake, he's recovering, and he knows everything. Carlo looked back down at the ring. He knew Victor's paranoia. He knew Victor wouldn't surrender the signet unless the situation was entirely desperate, or unless he trusted the messenger with his life. Leo called a meeting for tomorrow night. Carlo murmured, almost to himself. He wants to consolidate the territories. He wants the capos to vote him in as acting boss. Victor knows, Tessa said, leaning closer to the glass. He said to tell you the vote is a trap. If Leo takes the chair, he's going to purge the loyalists. He's going to start with you. Carlo's jaw clenched. The pieces were locking into place. The sudden isolation of the boss, the convenient medical diagnosis, Leo's rapid aggressive maneuvering in the background. It made perfect, terrifying sense. He looked at Tessa. He saw the bruises of exhaustion under her eyes, but he also saw a steel in her posture that money couldn't buy. What does he want us to do? Carlo asked. He wants you at the estate tomorrow night for the sit-down, Tessa said. He wants you to bring your best men, but leave them outside the gates. Don't engage Leo's security. If we don't engage, Leo has the numbers inside the house. Carlo pointed out. Dante commands 30 men on the perimeter. Dante is loyal to the boss. Tessa corrected. Not the underboss. He just doesn't know the boss is awake yet. Victor will handle Dante. You just need to be in the room when Leo calls for the vote. Carlo picked up the ring. He rolled it between his fingers, feeling the familiar, heavy weight of the gold. A slow, dark smile crept onto his face. It was the smile of a wolf smelling blood on the wind. Tell Victor, Carlo said quietly, handing the ring back to her, that his prime cut will be delivered tomorrow at 8. And tell him. Carlo paused, looking at the young maid with a newfound, profound respect. Tell him he chose a hell of a messenger. Tessa pocketed the ring. She didn't smile back. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a cold, hollow dread in her stomach. The fuse was lit. Tomorrow night the Rossi mansion was going to become a slaughterhouse. I'll tell him, Tessa said. She turned and walked out of the shop back into the freezing rain, knowing she had just crossed a line she could never, ever step back from. Friday night brought a storm that turned the Rossi estate into a fortress of black umbrellas and idling armored SUVs. The capos arrived at 8 o'clock sharp. They walked through the grand foyer in heavy wool overcoats, shaking off the rain, their expressions locked into grim masks of obligatory mourning. There were 6 of them representing the major arteries of the Rossi syndicate: extortion ports, narcotics, gambling, and sanitation. Carlo was the last to arrive. He handed his wet coat to a valet, his eyes briefly scanning the upper balcony. He saw nothing but shadows. The sit-down took place in the main dining room. It was a cavernous space dominated by a 30-foot mahogany table. Leo sat at the head. It was a subtle brazen violation of protocol. That chair belonged to Victor, dead or alive, until a formal vote was cast. But Leo looked perfectly at home. He wore a black suit and a somber, practiced frown. Upstairs, the dying king was putting on his armor. Tessa stood in the master closet, helping Victor thread a black silk tie under the collar of his crisp white shirt. It was an agonizing process. The Prussian blue had cleared his mind and restored his major motor functions, but the residual nerve damage left his fingers stiff and clumsy. He batted her hands away halfway through, his jaw clenching, as he forced his own trembling fingers to tie the Windsor knot. "I can do it," he rasped. Tessa stepped back, holding his suit jacket. "Conserve your energy. You have a long walk to the dining room." Victor finished the knot and turned to the full-length mirror. The man looking back at him was a ghost of the boss who had ruled Miami a year ago. The bespoke charcoal suit tailored for a 200-pound bruiser hung loosely on his wasted frame. The hollows of his cheeks were sharp, bruised with exhaustion. But his eyes were terrifying. They were completely devoid of the milky, drugged haze of the past 6 months. They were pitch black, sharp as broken glass. He slipped his arms into the jacket Tessa held up for him. "They're all downstairs?" Tessa said quietly. "Dante has 10 men in the hall. Leo has his personal detail stationed by the dining room doors. If Carlo didn't bring his people, you're walking into a firing squad." "Carlo brought his people," Victor said, adjusting his cuffs. He reached for the heavy silver-handled cane leaning against the dresser. He hated the cane, but he needed it to mask the slight drag in his left leg. "Leo thinks he's playing chess, but he's just a rat in a maze eating the cheese." Victor turned to her. He didn't offer a dramatic speech. He didn't thank her. He simply looked at the woman in the grey uniform who had dragged him back from the edge of an unmarked grave. "Stay here, Harper," he ordered. "Lock the door. Do not open it until I come back." Tessa shook her head. "No." Victor's eyes narrowed. "This isn't a negotiation. Once I cross that threshold, blood is going to spill. You are a civilian. I'm the reason you're breathing." Tessa shot back, her voice low and completely steady. "I scrubbed your vomit. I smuggled your antidotes. I walked into a slaughterhouse to deliver your ring. I'm not hiding in a closet while you finish this. I'm walking out there with you." Victor stared at her. For a fleeting second, the cold, ruthless exterior cracked, revealing a profound, dangerous admiration. She wasn't a civilian anymore. She hadn't been since the night she stared down the barrel of his gun and told him the truth. "Fine," Victor murmured. "Stay behind my right shoulder." Downstairs, the air in the dining room was thick with cigar smoke and tension. The doctors give him 48 hours. Leo was saying, his voice a perfect pitch of sorrowful resignation. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Dr. Lipton signed the affidavit this morning. Victor's nervous system is gone. He's completely unresponsive." Murmurs rippled down the table. Carlo sat near the middle, perfectly still, sipping a glass of bourbon. "The ports are vulnerable." Leo continued, his tone shifting from mourning brother to pragmatic leader. "The Colombians know Victor is sick. They're probing our supply lines. We cannot project weakness right now. I am asking this commission to formally transfer the title of Don to me, effective immediately, so I can secure our borders." "It's fast, Leo." One of the older capos grunted. "Victor's still breathing." "Barely," Leo said sharply. "We don't have the luxury of sentimentality." The heavy oak doors of the dining room didn't just open. They slammed backward, the brass handles cracking against the drywall like a gunshot. Every man at the table froze. 2 of Leo's guards reached for the holsters under their jackets. Victor Rossi stood in the doorway. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, and terrifying. It was the silence of men watching a corpse climb out of a casket. Victor leaned heavily on his silver cane, his chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths. Behind him stood Dante, his cinder-block face utterly impassive, his hand resting casually on the grip of his sidearm. And just behind Victor's right shoulder stood Tessa, completely invisible to the room, yet seeing everything. Leo's face went entirely slack. The blood drained from his cheeks so fast he looked instantly violently ill. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white. "Leo," Victor said. His voice wasn't the booming baritone it used to be. It was a raspy, gravelly whisper, but it carried to the back of the room like thunder. "You're sitting in my chair. Victor." Leo choked on the name. He scrambled to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood. "Boss? What? You should be in bed. The doctors are currently having their bank accounts audited by our friends at the IRS." Victor interrupted, taking a slow, agonizing step into the room. Each step was a calculated exertion of willpower over shattered nerves. "Turns out Dr. Lipton has a gambling habit. Turns out he takes cash to look the other way." Victor reached the table. The capos scrambled to their feet, knocking over half-empty glasses of scotch in their haste to show respect. Victor ignored them. His eyes were locked solely on Leo. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the wooden tea box. He tossed it onto the polished mahogany. It slid to a stop, inches from Leo's hands. "Thallium," Victor said. The word dropped like an anvil in the quiet room. "Tasteless, odorless, melts the nervous system down to scrap metal. Costs about $50 on the street. A cheap weapon for a cheap man." Leo's eyes darted frantically around the room. He was a cornered animal. He looked at his two personal guards standing by the wall, then looked at the capos. "He's delirious!" Leo shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "The disease has spread to his brain. He doesn't know what he's saying. Dante the man is a danger to himself. Get him back upstairs!" Dante didn't move. He simply shifted his weight, his dead eyes fixed on Leo. "I'm not crazy, Leo," Victor said softly. "I'm just awake." Victor turned his head slightly, making eye contact with Carlo. Carlo gave a fraction of a nod. Outside in the freezing rain, the muffled, silenced coughs of gunfire echoed faintly through the reinforced windows. Carlo's men were dismantling Leo's external security detail. The trap was sprung. Leo heard the shots. The reality of his situation crashed down on him. He lunged. He didn't go for Victor. He went for the gun tucked in his own waistband. He cleared the holster, raising the barrel. Before Victor could even flinch, Dante moved. The enforcer drew his weapon with terrifying speed and fired twice. The deafening cracks shattered the dining room window. Leo was thrown backward, his chest erupting in a spray of crimson. He hit the floor hard, his gun skittering across the wood, spinning until it hit Victor's leather shoe. The room erupted into chaos. Capos shouted drawing weapons. "Stand down!" Carlo roared, flipping the heavy mahogany table onto its side with a massive heave, providing cover, his own gun drawn and leveled at the remaining capos. "The king is alive. Anyone who raises a hand dies with the traitor." Nobody moved. The capos looked at Leo's bleeding body, then looked at Victor. The boss hadn't flinched. He stood over the dying underboss, his face a mask of absolute, unforgiving ice. Victor looked down at Leo. Leo was gasping, blood bubbling at the corner of his lips. "You got greedy," Victor whispered. He didn't wait for Leo's last words. Victor turned his back on the dying man and looked at the capos. "The ports belong to Carlo now. Get this garbage out of my house." He turned and walked back out the doors. Tessa followed. The adrenaline carried Victor all the way to the third-floor study. The moment the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them, the strings holding him up snapped. His cane slipped on the Persian rug and his legs buckled. Tessa caught him. She braced her shoulder under his arm, taking his weight just as she had the first night, and guided him to the leather armchair. He collapsed into it, a fine sheen of sweat soaking his shirt, his chest heaving as the pain in his nervous system flared violently from the exertion. Tessa went to the dry bar. She didn't reach for the tea. She poured 2 fingers of straight, unpoisoned scotch into a glass and brought it to him. Victor took it. His hands were shaking again, but this time it was just the adrenaline. He downed the liquor in one burning swallow and let his head fall back against the leather. The silence in the room was different now. It wasn't the silence of a tomb. It was the silence of a storm that had finally passed. "I made a call this morning." Victor said, his voice rough. He didn't open his eyes. "To the bookies on the south side. Your brother's debt is cleared. The ledger is clean. He owes nothing." Tessa exhaled. It was a long, shuddering breath she felt like she had been holding for a year. The invisible weight crushing her chest evaporated. Her brother was safe. She was free. "Thank you," she whispered. Victor opened his eyes. He looked at her. She was still wearing the drab, grey maid's uniform, splattered with a few drops of rain from the hallway. But she didn't look like a maid. She looked like the most dangerous person in the room. "There's a duffel bag in the closet," Victor said quietly. $500,000 in untraceable cash. You take it. You take your brother, you move out of state, and you never look back." Tessa looked at the closet door. $500,000. Freedom. Or, Victor added, his voice dropping an octave heavy and magnetic, "You stay." Tessa turned back to him. "I need people who can see the dirt under the rug." Victor said, his dark eyes locking onto hers, stripping away the titles, the money, the Mafia hierarchy, leaving only the raw, undeniable current that had sparked between them in the dark hours of his recovery. "I don't trust the suits. I don't trust the degrees. I trust you, Tessa." He wasn't offering her a mop. He was offering her a place at his side, a partnership forged in poison and survival. Tessa looked at the man in the chair. He was ruthless. He was a criminal. He was entirely corrupt. But he was also the only man in the world who had ever truly seen her. Tessa slowly reached up and pulled the pins out of her severe bun. Her dark hair fell around her shoulders in a cascade, softening her face. She walked over to the desk, picked up the small silver tray holding her cleaning supplies, and casually dropped it into the wastebasket. "I always hated this uniform," Tessa said softly. Victor Rossi smiled. It was a small, dangerous smile. "We'll get you a new one. Money and power can build an empire, but it takes grit and absolute loyalty to keep it from burning down." Tessa started as the invisible help scrubbing the floors of a dying king, but she ended up becoming the only person he could trust with his life. Sometimes the most dangerous players in the game are the ones nobody notices until it's too late. If you loved this dark, slow-burn thriller about survival and unexpected loyalty, hit that like button, share this video with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe for more deeply grounded, intense stories. See you next time.